how does recent developments about the Neanderthals actually disprove the Bible, but yet give more credibility to the Sumerian story than the biblical story? And I'm bringing this up, and let me give a couple of caveats first. Number one, I do not accept the biblical story as the true origin of the planet and human beings and this God existing. Number two, I do not believe that the Anunnaki story is the true story of our creation or development on this planet. So I am not saying the Anunnaki story is actually a true story as well. And I want to make sure that before some of the unintelligent get on here and start speaking about how I'm just following along Billy Carson's teaching, but I was reading the Anunnaki story before there ever was a Billy Carson, before there ever was a YouTube, TikTok, any of these other programs. Number three is the fact that I do not believe that Neanderthal and Homo sapiens are two different types of human, two different types of species. They are just two different types of humans. One is no greater than the other. Both in the crossbreeding were able to deposit DNA attributes that were beneficial to man, period. Just as any type of crossbreeding would do that the strongest genes that are more adaptable to any environment that they are living in are going to be the genes that show up more often. So let's make that clear. So how does the evidence of Neanderthals disprove the Bible? Well, according to your biblical story, many, although will take Genesis 1 and 2 and separate them as two different stories, talking about two different creations, but in all actuality, Genesis 2 was written first, and then Genesis 1 was written to give a more broader idea of what was going on during the same time of this creation. So they're not exactly two different stories. Most biblical scholars have come to that conclusion than the conclusion of two different creations. So it does not, Neanderthal's existence does not explain where Cain got a wife or the land of Nod or any of those things. What it does do is demonstrate that since Adam and Eve, the creation story of the Bible, had to have occurred around 4,600 BCE, and the fact that Neanderthals have been around since 50,000 BCE at minimum, they were probably around even before then, that the biblical story falls flat on its face because humans, whether sub-Saharan Homo sapiens or Neanderthals, were in existence 200,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, 125,000 years ago. We have Adam's calendar in southern Africa that demonstrates human civilizations or people groups existing as a community around 200,000 years ago. So that information about Homo sapiens and Neanderthals completely dismisses the biblical creation story. And although many Christians have come on and said, well, you're only talking about young earth. If you believe in the Bible, you are a young earth believer. You may try to change it, but you cannot. You believe in young earth because the dating back of the biblical story goes back to 4,600 BCE. There's no way around it. Either you accept the Bible for what it says or you just lying to be a liar. Now, how does this prove the Anunnaki story? It doesn't prove the Anunnaki story. What I'm saying is that it gives more evidence towards the Anunnaki story while it at the same time takes away from the idea of the biblical story ever being true. For those who do not know the Anunnaki story, and this is something that you could have been reading about in the 90s, actually the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, long before there was a Billy Carson, long before there was a YouTube, Facebook, and all these other social medias. You could have been studying this information as it was developing over that time frame. But according to the Anunnaki story, Anu, Enlil, Enki, and Ninharsag gathered together down in the Apsu, which would be that area where Adam's calendar was discovered around South Africa, Botswana area, that they gathered together to create a form of being from a common ancestor being that was already around in order to speed up their evolution so that they can avert a war between the Anunnaki and the Igigi by creating a slave labor force. They tried 16 different variations of human in order to create this. The 15th version could easily be applied to the Neanderthals as their version of man that was able to survive, but didn't quite have every aspect of what they needed in order to have this slave race. And then it was Homo sapien that was then created to be able to have this slave race. So in that thinking, the Neanderthals, after they were created, but not exactly what they wanted, could have easily been sent to their encampments or their mining facilities in Europe in order to be their slave force up there, but probably weren't in a situation where they were able to be servants of the gods, as they put it. So the Homo sapien was created as the being that was able to do this, and from that they got Adapa and Titi. Now, according to this story, Adapa and Titi were then sent to the Garden of Eden in Chaldea, where they were there to manage all the human creations that the Anunnaki had made. This would include the Neanderthals. So based on this information, Neanderthal and Homo sapiens around 50,000 BCE, Homo sapiens migrated up into Europe and then began crossbreeding with the Neanderthal, which is why Europeans have more Neanderthal DNA than anybody else. Sub-Saharan Africans do not have any. Then those who were crossbred after a 7,000 year period, and I don't like how this caption says Neanderthal and humans because they're both the same. And I know many people are going to get into the comments telling us we have a Neanderthal in the office right now. But anyway, that's not true. No one is not greater than the other. Neanderthals had developed an ability to be able to withstand the cold better. They had developed an ability to ward off the diseases that they would have to deal with. Their musculature was very different than the musculature of Homo sapiens. So they both had different aspects that each one, that the crossbred children would have had the benefit of both, whatever the greatest benefit of both groups. So what this produced was a hybrid that then began migrating from Europe to East Asia, which is where you find less than the European, but still Neanderthal DNA, and then into West Asia, where it's even less Neanderthal DNA has been given to those who were born in China and places of that nature. So all this really means is that humans migrated. Now, if you think about it, as I said before, this takes away from the biblical creation of man at 4,600 BCE, since we know there's evidence of man being around much longer. But at the same time, this also takes away from the idea of the Anunnaki, although they said that they took these creations and moved them around to the different encampments by which they had all over the planet. This would have started this would have started, according to the Sumerian story, like 500,000 years ago. But we see that this in 50,000 BCE was a human migration time frame. People moved into that area. Did they take Homo sapiens and purposely move them to Europe and allow them to crossbreed with the Neanderthal? You can make a case for it, but everything seems like it happened over an incredibly slow period of time. Not they just grabbed a bunch of people, moved them to Europe, and then started crossbreeding them. This happened over a 7,000 year time frame for the genome to kind of solidify itself before it then migrated into East Asia and West Asia. So it's most likely just humans being on the planet, evolving over periods of time, and then as the different types of humans evolve, once they start migrating and meeting each other, the genome started to create, in the crossbreeding process, started to settle more into what we have today. So the Anunnaki story is just as made up as the biblical story, but this information is more adaptable to the Anunnaki story than it is to the biblical story, which is another reason why we recognize that the biblical story is in no way, shape, or form the true story of man, the true story of creation. We have absolutely no idea how it all started at the very, very beginning. We have only gone as far back as that there must have been a common ancestor, and from that common ancestor, you had the splitting of different types, whether the great apes, the monkeys, and humans. And from humans, the split of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, all of them. But that has nothing to do with your Bible. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable.